Let's discuss the types of laptop displays and technologies you should know for the A+ exams. The liquid crystal display, or LCD, is the main type of display used by laptops. The difference is how they are lit, which I'll return to in a moment. Now, LCDs have two sheets of polarizing material which is used in thin film transistor, or TFT, displays. These are often active matrix. By active matrix, I mean that they have multiple transistors within each pixel. These are low energy devices compared to the much older cathode ray tube displays, or CRT displays, which, by the way, you might still see in some labs. However, these LCDs still use more energy and are less efficient than newer displays that use LED or OLED backlighting. It's the backlighting differences that you really need to know for the exam. LCDs originally used a lamp and inverter to light up the display. Overwhelmingly, this lamp was a cold cathode fluorescent lamp, or CCFL, and it would be somewhere on the bottom of the display here. These generally require AC power. Because the laptop runs internally on DC power, we need an inverter to change the power from DC to AC to power the lamp. And that inverter would usually be somewhere in here on the display, perhaps in the computer, in the main body here. It's an extra step that creates two potential points of failure: that lamp and that inverter. It's also not the most efficient way of doing things, because normally with a laptop, we are converting from AC to DC at the power brick, and then inverting from DC to AC inside the laptop. So today we have other lighting sources. And the first is LED, which stands for light emitting diode. These are also referred to as LED LCDs, which might sound confusing at first, but remember that it is the same type of display that we have here, just with different backlighting. And I say just, but really it is a big deal. First, everyone knows how energy efficient LEDs are. If you've ever replaced an incandescent light bulb in your house with an LED, you can measure the difference in electricity used. Typically, it's a fraction of incandescent and fluorescent bulbs. So the same efficiency applies to LED backlit displays. The RGB diodes, the red, green, and blue diodes, are very small and quite capable. And secondly, they don't require AC power. They run off of DC, which means that they don't need an inverter. And in general, they use less power, which conserves the laptop's battery. As of the recording of this video, these are the most common type of display and backlighting. In a minute, I'll disassemble a laptop's LED display just to show it a little bit. A derivative of LED is organic LED, or OLED. OLEDs use different material that can be printed onto, and you can print, quote unquote, this material onto just about anything, and they can be incredibly small. As of the recording of this video, OLEDs offer the best black levels, but you might want to go with straight LED if you're more interested in brightness and possibly viewing angle. Let's take a look at an LED display, also known as an LED LCD now. Okay, so here we have a laptop, and basically to get the display out of here, to get the actual display out, we have two screws on the bottom. There's one here and one here, and they're covered with caps. I've already removed the cap on one, and so I'll remove the cap on the other one here. And let's zoom in a little bit. And you want to use the right tool for this. And here we have a tool. This is a metal prying tool. You want it to have a thin end. And it has to be strong, but it has to be kind of pointy as well, so you can get in there to get access to that cap and get that cap out. You don't want to damage these if at all possible, or damage the bezel. So you want to kind of pry these out with one of these tools. There we go. One shot and no damage. Should be good. Place that aside. That's just a sticky cap. You can always get new ones if you need to, and then we can just unscrew those two screws. And I'm using my trusty number 1 Phillips head screwdriver. And if you're ever wondering, you can see the number 1 here. So trusty number 1 Phillips head screwdriver, and we'll get the other guy here. I already took the cap off. And that's the first step. Got to get those caps and the screws off of there. Okay, and at this point I might expose some circuitry. So we want to make sure that we have our ESD protection in place. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. Okay, and you want to have a good assortment of tools with you, as far as prying tools, with flat ends, pointy ends, plastic, metal, as I mentioned. And one of the tools I like is something a little bit wider for this job. Pretty thin, pretty wide, pretty strong, but a little bit flexible, so that we can pry this monitor out. Sometimes what I like to do is I like to cover the monitor display with paper or something else, so as not to scratch it, because you want to be really careful when you go in here. You want to put your shim in there and just gently get underneath and start prying out. Okay, and you might want to use 2 shims, and you want to carefully start removing this. Okay, so you might hear a little bit of a crack there as you're prying this out, and we want to do that all the way around. Just try not to actually press against the screen itself. And when you get up to this area, you want to be careful, because you have your webcam and microphones here. So you want to be sure to pry around those and be real careful with that. Once it starts coming out, you can use your fingers to help pop it out of its connectors. And there's several other tools we can use with this. Again, you just want to be careful as you're going around. And I actually paused the video. I like to go around and shim slowly all the way around a couple times and slowly remove it, so that we don't bend or damage the bezel or the display. And if it doesn't go, we don't want to force it. So we'll just slowly work it. Slowly working on that bezel so we don't damage it. Almost there. And the last one is where you can definitely do damage sometimes. There we go. And we got it off, and it actually looks fairly clean. Another place to watch, to be careful, is here at the hinges. You want to make sure you don't crack anything or damage anything. So this looks pretty good, actually. Put that to the side. And then we have access to our display. And generally you have a couple screws holding that in. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then we have additional screws here for the chassis for the display. And you'll notice some power here. We have a power cable that leads to the connector for the display. Then we have another power cable and control cable for our webcam assembly, which goes all the way down this way. So sometimes you might need to replace these as well. And if you put in a new display, it may or may not come with this cable. So you may have to get that separate if you need a new one. So next step is to unscrew that. Now the trusty number 1 Phillips head screwdriver is usually good enough, but you probably want to have some mini screwdrivers available to you. Much smaller screwdrivers for working on laptops. So that's something you probably want to have in your toolkit. And really, mobile device kits are pretty easy to get your hands on and are fairly inexpensive. And so that's definitely a good idea. And it's also a good idea to have some type of cloth that you can put the screen on when you take it out. Okay, so you want to have something put down to protect that so we don't scratch it. And basically it just lifts out. And I like to lift it out and pull down. Now at this point, you want to be real careful with the connector that's here. Okay, so when we're taking the connector out, we quite often will have a piece of tape here, and we'll have to remove that. And one of your really thin pieces of shim can help to get some of that tape off. Don't want to press too hard on the monitor, but we're going to want to pull that tape in the label, because that's actually connected to that connector. It's kind of protecting it. Okay, and that exposes the connector, and then we can pull that connector out. Pull it out evenly. Okay, put that to the side, and then we can take our display and remove that. Because you never know, maybe the display is actually working. If you're removing the display, you should have troubleshot a lot of other things first. But just be ready to just be careful with it just in case, because you never know, and hold it by the edges. Okay, this is a test computer, so I'm not really too worried about it. But the new display we'd place down on a material like this, and then plug it back in and put everything back together. Okay, so this is an LED-based LCD. So again, it's an LCD display, but it uses LED. It uses diodes, so very efficient. And then in addition to that, we don't have an inverter to worry about. We don't have that CCFL backlight that can go bad. If anything's going to go bad, it's either going to be the connector, which can happen, or the display itself needs to be replaced. That's about it when it comes to these LED screens. So we can connect this guy back in and just connect it all in one shot. Make sure that there's no copper connectors showing. Tape it back down. Carefully place the screen back in position. Line up the screw holes. Make sure that the power cable for this, the display cable, is run properly in its channel. Because once we put the bezel on, we don't want anything to get damaged. Okay, then we can screw that guy back in with our 4 screws. Always keep your screws in some type of cup, baby food jar, something to keep those handy, and keep them separated. You might want to have several jars set aside that are labeled for different types of screws. Write it out, document, because sometimes all these screws, it can get a little bit confusing which is which. But this is a fairly simple change out. And then finally we would put the bezel back on and snap it back in one piece at a time. When I talk about the webcam a little bit in a separate video, once I show that, then we'll put the bezel back on permanently. So there's a little bit of display removal and how you go about doing that with a typical LED-based LCD display. And again, the main things here are to really watch for the cable that's in the hinge here, how it's routed, and that connector. You want to make sure that you're very careful with that connector. It's very easy to damage those. Very thin connector when you reconnect those. And it's all about the tools. You know, the right prying tools for the job. And these are the two main tools that I used. And you'll note that there wasn't a mark on the caps or the display or the bezel. And that's what we want. So that's about it for this lesson. Make sure you know the difference between regular old LCDs that use the backlight and an inverter and LCDs like the one that we have here that are LED based, and also the difference between those and OLED or OLED. So that's it for this video.